no one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
The idea that we once were in a golden age of, we took things at face value and we can't do that anymore. I'm not sure that really stands up to scrutiny. Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So we're in the middle of doing a whole series about artificial intelligence, and we thought that it would be interesting to go back to somebody who we've had on before about evidence particularly.
Yeah, we had Yvonne on to talk before about how judges were learning about the use of social media in trials. And I think we then talked about Bellingcat, and we had the judge Joanne Corner say something about that.
Yeah, that was fun. I mean, it showed how skeptical a judge can be, but also how an expert witness can kind of help them along and explain new and unfamiliar stuff and really get them to accept user-generated evidence.
But we're now living in a world of AI slop on social media, and we kind of see everything and nothing is believable. And judges are also human beings. So how will reality be assessed in courts and in international trials from now on?
Our trusty source, as mentioned already, for user-generated content, or, I don't know what I was writing there, user-granted concrete? No, user-generated content and evidence is Yvonne McDermott Rees. Hi, Yvonne.
Hi, Janet. Hi, Steph. Great to see you.
Yvonne is now at Queen's University Belfast School of Law, and she's still doing experiments with courts and lawyers and jurors even, God forbid, and testing how people understand standards of proof and limits of expert evidence. And we will put a link to one of these in the show notes, where there is a great team of prosecutors and defense and former ICC Judge Howard Morrison put in the hot seat, where they're testing people's reaction to pattern recognition evidence.
I don't even know what that is, Steph. I mean, I wrote it down. It's copy-paste, so maybe we'll come back to that.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that and ask it later. But it's part of the True project, where Yvonne is the principal investigator, and I'm sure she will tell us much more about it later.
And this time she's joined by Anne Hausknecht. Hi, Anne.
Hi, Janet. Hi, Steph. Thanks for having me on.
And Anne is a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Institute of Technology and Justice. She's also on the same True project. And in some of the work she's been doing with Yvonne, she's been exploring the impact of deepfakes on trust in user-generated evidence and how that works in accountability processes for human rights violations. And her research focuses primarily on the use of user-generated evidence in domestic prosecutions of core international crimes. And Anne is being supervised in a PhD by Yvonne. So let's see how much they agree with each other. Over to you, Steph.
Well, I wanted to ask one definition thing before we dove into the deep end. What is the definition of user-generated evidence? Because generated to me kind of implies manufactured. So are we talking about, people who make videos of alleged violations, or are we talking about people who generate some kind of content by example, reconstructions of things that happened?
We define user-generated evidence as information. So this is images, video, text, audio created by, so that's the generated part, by ordinary people, basically, not professional investigators, on their own personal digital devices. And what makes it evidence is its potential use as legal evidence in accountability processes. So we're talking really about the eyewitness who records a video, someone who takes an image, not someone who decides, I'll create an AI model or an AI reconstruction. That will be something different.
Okay, but I think we will also include a bit on reconstructions, because I think that's interesting, sort of where the line lies between one thing and the other, because one can lead in to the other.
Absolutely.
In the Al Hassan and in the Al Mahdi trial, I know you've had people talk about this before, the digital reconstruction that was created by Situ Research, an architecture firm in New York City. And that basically used
user-generated evidence, so videos they found on YouTube, satellite imaging, things like this, and put it all together into a digital reconstruction. So yeah, they're closely related.
I think there's an opportunity for a Stephopedia here.
I am diving in for this Stephopedia. Yes, so the Al-Makdi and the Al-Hassan trials are the ICC cases that have to do with the destruction of religious sites in Timbuktu by Islamists who took over that city in Mali. And so Al-Mahdi was specifically destruction of tombs and religious sites, and Al-Hassan was that, and also floggings and basically terrorizing the population of Timbuktu. And they had reconstructions of some of the sites where crimes happened.
Just one last point to add on why we use the term user-generated evidence as opposed to open source evidence, something like that, is, as you know, previous research I carried out together with my colleagues really looked at the open source research or open source evidence. But increasingly, we're finding this kind of content isn't posted online. It's sent directly to investigators. It's captured using maybe dedicated apps like the Eyewitness to Atrocity app, which was created by the International Bar Association. By today, the Office of the Prosecutor has got this platform where anyone can upload relevant evidence of international crimes. So we didn't want to exclude that closed source content, because actually, when it comes to evaluating it and considering its credibility, the questions are the same, regardless of whether it's open source or closed source. So that's why we've broadened out to user-generated evidence.
Okay, I'll start using that from now on. But I wanted to also just ask this, crazy philosophical question maybe, but it comes up for me again and again. Are we any good as human beings about distinguishing between factual stuff and fictional stuff? How do we know what we're watching is reality? And obviously I don't want to spend the whole podcast doing philosophy, but how can you describe that to us?
Well, I could start. So we've been doing some research. I've got a wonderful colleague, Ruben, who's been looking more from psychology perspective and how good are we actually at spotting deepfakes. And it turns out really not that good. It's like flipping a coin. And I think we see deepfakes getting better and better. So it's getting harder and harder. But one thing, and one sort of argument that we always trying to make is that manipulation of audiovisual content is not new. And this is something that we've been talking to judges at the International Criminal Court, that they mentioned, they said, well, deepfakes, that's just the newest form of manipulating content. But there's always been other ways you can edit content. What we see a lot is misattribution. So taking a video out of context and saying, oh, this just happened in Ukraine. So I think what we've seen is that this awareness that a video can only ever show so much. You don't know why someone started to film at one point and then stopped. What's actually not being captured on camera? That's really important. And I think that a lot of judges are quite aware of that. And that's where there's so many factors that we can consider when it comes to authenticating content and telling whether something is fake or not. And I think the key one is corroboration. We see that in most of the cases. You either have another video or a photograph to corroborate the finding, but a lot of times it's eyewitnesses that are called in to confirm that something actually happened.
You say that judges are kind of used to doctored images, or that they've had this before, but one of the things that we see with judges is sometimes they're not necessarily au fait with kind of new technology, and they need new skills to look at this. Do you think, everybody talks about AI being this revolutionary change, especially if you work in journalism, it really gets touted as something that is going to fundamentally change our job. Do you think it will also fundamentally change judges' jobs in that sense, in the content that they get, or having to weed out what is real and not real?
Are you saying, Steph, that they're old like me? Is that what you're saying? That because they're old, they won't be able to understand what's going on?
I'm saying they're even older than you, and even I am, I'm very much Gen X, and it means that I kind of stopped at Instagram. I have an Instagram account, but I still don't quite know how to do it, and I see how quick technology becomes obsolete and how at a certain point you just don't deal with the new technology anymore. So I think this goes for judges as well.
Definitely. So I think there's definitely need for training, giving them at least a basic understanding of what is a deepfake, how can we spot it. Deepfake detection tools, they are not very accurate. So I think it's important for judges to understand that relying on a tool isn't the sort of panacea. We also have to have an expert coming in to authenticate content. But I don't think that's necessarily just the case for judges. Speaking to investigators, prosecutors, I think everyone still has this big need for more awareness about deepfakes and training. So I think it's sort of this overarching, everyone should be aware that what they see online isn't necessarily authentic.
And just to add to, like, I'm not sure I agree with the premise that the role of the journalist is going to be changed completely in the age of AI, nor do I think the role of the judge is going to be completely transformed in an age of AI. I mean, as Anne said, this is maybe a new face on an old problem, but, if we were ever, I don't know, sent a document or shown an image, did we ever believe that that's what it purports to be? Just as journalists have those skills in terms of looking, well, let's look at the source. Where did this come from? Who sent it to me? Is this a reliable source? Is it, as Anne said, is it corroborated by other information? So, I think sometimes there's a perception that, back in the old days, we used to take things at face value and we can't do that anymore with AI. But I'm not sure that was ever true. Photoshop has been around for quite a long time. And Anne, in her PhD, has this really good example of in 1870 in the US, there was a guy called William Mumner who created this sort of spirit photography. So he would say to people, you've lost your loved one in the American Civil War. I can bring them back in my images. And essentially what he was doing was sort of double processing the negatives. So he'd take a picture of someone and then have it looked like the spirit of their loved one in the background, and he got prosecuted for fraud. But that was 150 years ago. So yeah, I think the idea that we once were in a golden age of we took things at face value and we can't do that anymore, I'm not sure that really stands up to scrutiny.
But are you finding in the work that you're doing with judges, whether domestically or at the International Criminal Court, that they are, I don't know, pushing back to some degree on visual evidence and saying, okay, that is less reliable than we might have hoped it would be, and we're really going to have to go back to basis? Or are you finding them saying, okay, understood, we now need to get our heads around things like authenticity, watermarks, how to assess something? Which way are judges going?
I would say it's more the latter. I think there's more an interest on how can we actually authenticate content, geolocation, chronolocation, so determining where and when was something captured by looking at specific landmarks, looking at the weather patterns or the shadows in a video or photograph. So I think this sort of idea that we can't rely on user-generated evidence anymore, that doesn't really pan out. It's more like, what role can it play? I don't think we will see a case at an international court or even in domestic cases that I looked at where we just rely on one video or photograph, because even if it's not a deep fake, could have just been staged or taken out of context. So again, corroboration and just being a bit more thorough with regards to authentication. And then I think also expert testimony is really important, having an expert to come in and not just go through the steps that they took in authenticating content, but also just explaining how they go about that and how we can tell fake from true.
One of the things I wanted to ask about is that in some kind of content generators, you have this kind of digital watermark or added metadata comes from what is known as C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. Can you explain a bit what that does and how we are seeing that in user-generated content that is maybe used in legal cases?
Yeah, sure. So C2PA is like an industry standard. So it's inherent in some hardware. I think, for example, Sony have signed up, other, particular camera makers, Google, if you've got a Google Pixel phone, it will be embedding the C2PA metadata, but also in software. So if you amend an image using Photoshop, Google Gemini, ChatGPT, in theory, at least, that should have that stamp on it. And then you can go to, I think the website is contentcredentials.org, upload the image, and then you can see that C2PA stamp. So for example, if I edit an image using Gemini and say, here's a picture of me and Steph, can you add Janet in? It'll just say, this was amended using Gemini. So we can see that there was some AI manipulation of it. So that's something useful. I think, like Anne said earlier, we can't rely on it as a panacea. I think sometimes people say, oh, well, this is the answer. We just need to get C2PA in everything, and then we'll be able to tell that it's reliable or not. Some of the dangers with that line of thinking is, first of all, not every device will have it. So famously, Apple hasn't signed up because it kind of goes against their privacy, the importance they put on privacy. There are all sorts of other device manufacturers that won't be part of C2PA. Secondly, I think, we have to be concerned about potentially there are witness protection kind of issues here. So C2PA doesn't say Yvonne McDermott took that image, but it will say it was taken by this kind of device. Depending on the device or whatever, it might say in Belfast on this date. And, if you think about if you've got a human rights defender in a region where there's a crackdown on human rights defenders, there might be ways in which you could use that information and triangulate it with other information to identify the identity of someone. So I think we need to kind of push back on the idea that C2PA is the answer. Like everything, it's just one of these factors that can be taken into account when holistically assessing a piece of evidence.
Okay, so that was my question was about judges. What about prosecution and defense? I mean, are there differences there in the way in which they are regarding the use of images? I'm trying to think, particularly defense work is to try to poke holes in things and to say this isn't right and so on. So are we getting things like a battle of expert witnesses where one says it's this and the other says it's that in terms of images and, that it's been AI'd? How is that working in court?
I think with regards to the defense, one issue is really quality of arms and whether they have access to as much information as prosecution would have. A lot of the content that we see is guarded by civil society actors. They don't necessarily collect the kind of information that the defense would find useful. So that is a big issue there. I don't know, Yvonne, if you wanted to say something about the battle of experts.
Yeah. So in the cases that Anne has looked at, there have been usually expert witnesses from national forensic institutes. Sometimes the defense will call their own expert witness, but it really hasn't been that battle of experts thing hasn't come out in very many cases. There was one case I remember from Sweden, and it was a case where it was one of these cases of returning ISIS fighters, and the defendants were shown in this image of a beheading video, but they had their faces covered, so they had a mask and also something, so all you could see is the eyes. But one of them had a tattoo on his arm or on his hand, and they also spoke a dialect of Swedish, but a dialect that's quite unique to Western Sweden. So someone from the Swedish Forensic Institute was like, I've done an analysis and the likelihood of it being someone other than this defendant who's got the same tattoo and is from Western Sweden is so small. And I remember the defense called their expert, a professor from Lund University called Christian Dahlman, who said, you've chosen the wrong reference class. You've compared it with everyone in Sweden, whereas actually you should look at what's the likelihood of a returning ISIS fighter from Western Sweden also having this tattoo, and then actually it could be someone else. But that didn't fly in the case and the defendant got convicted. But I think, we'll see. We saw it in our mock trial. The defense chose not to call their own expert witness, but rather to point to the limitations of the expert called by the prosecution and to try and, again, poke holes in, okay, well, what do you not know? Did you approach this with a sort of a biased mindset? Yeah, different ways of sort of undermining the expert. And interestingly, the majority of our juries acquitted. So 9 out of our 11 juries went not guilty, and the other 2 were hung juries. So they just couldn't reach a decision, even when they were told we'll accept a majority verdict. So that's what one that 10 out of 12 of them can agree on. So for me, this was a real eye-opener because I've always thought, well, it doesn't really matter if you don't know the source of a piece of user-generated evidence, or the person who captured it isn't able to come and testify, because you can always get an expert to independently verify it. And we saw that our juries just didn't think that was possible, really. They said, we think this expert seems qualified, reliable, and so forth. Yet they had doubts about whether the piece of user-generated evidence could be independently verified.
We kind of see that in journalism as well with images, that now, because the world is kind of less reliable and those deepfakes are getting better and images get doctored and end up on Twitter or X or wherever, there is a lot of people doubting genuine narratives or genuine pictures. Or if you want to cast doubt on something, you can just say, this is just like all the other stuff, and you can never now know that something's true. Is that something you think, is that an effect that you see with juries having to decide? And is there a big difference between, say, jurors and professional judges in that sense, if you've looked at that?
Yeah, I'll let Anne come in here first, because she had some really interesting findings on the extent to which that sort of deepfake defence has come up in court.
Yeah, so we haven't seen a sort of liar's dividend or deepfakes defense come up in any of the international crimes trials. I think mostly because the cases at the ICC and in the domestic courts, they all predate crimes that were committed before deepfakes. But we've seen this deepfake defense being raised in a couple of cases in the US. There are two cases that came out of the Capitol Hill storming, where the defendants themselves have been capturing a lot of photographs and videos, proudly sharing them with family and friends. And that content was then used as evidence against them. And counsel for them stood up in court and said, well, this could be fake. We can't trust this kind of evidence. And luckily, in those cases, there was CCTV footage, police camera footage to corroborate the findings. So there was enough corroboration there. But I do think that this is definitely increasingly a problem where experts are really important. One case in which the deepfake defense was used successfully was a murder trial in the US, where prosecution wanted to show a video on an iPad and used the zoom in function to sort of expand the video. And defense said, if you use the zoom function, it sort of manipulates the video. So the court said, okay, well, prosecution has to bring in an expert to explain that using the zoom function doesn't actually manipulate or use AI to change the video. And they couldn't find an expert, so they just could not use that as evidence in that case.
So on our juries, we did see a little bit of this. I remember one of the jury members in one of our groups said, oh, I saw a photo competition recently, and a very famous photo competition, and the guy who won it turns out that actually the whole photo was generated using AI. So that sort of doubt, I guess, is creeping in. But I think, people are logical and rational in terms of how they approach the evaluation of content. So we do a lot of online studies in the True Project, and people say, well, obviously I'd have to see, is there anything else on this incident? Or, I'd look at the source. I might ask friends and family. I might, make this evaluation holistically. So I think, yeah, we're not quite there yet, where we hear it a lot, right? Like, no one believes anything they see anymore. But I think it probably, this is such a lawyer's answer, it depends. We did see that idea of anything might be deepfake come up a bit in the European Court of Human Rights. There was a case the Ukraine and the Netherlands took against Russia around the attacks that started into eastern Ukraine back in 2013, was it, or 2014? But in that case, there was one particular image that had been circulating online that was used to geolocate this Russian soldier and the military unit to which he was a member to a particular site of strikes from eastern Ukraine. And there were actually two versions of the same photograph in circulation. So one had him with a tank in the background, and the tank number is on the tank, and then there's a column of soldiers behind him. And the other was without the tank number. And Bellingcat had used one in one of their reports, and the Atlantic Council had used the other version. So before the European Court of Human Rights, Russia really seized upon this discrepancy and said, and even the column of people behind, that could be cloned from a single individual. So it's that sort of deepfake defense coming in practice. And what the European Court did was they actually got a witness statement from Elliot Higgins from Bellingcat, who explained what happened was the soldier himself had used this image as his profile picture on bk.com, the social media site. And he'd used the first version, and then later he took it down and replaced it with the second version. So a very simple explanation. And the court said, well, that sort of explains that. And as for the others, things that Russia has referred to, they are only what the state has called indications of potential fakery. And the European Court's Grand Chamber said that falls quite significantly short of what we would need to see to be convinced that this is, in fact, a doctored image. So I think it goes to show that the sort of blithe assertion that anything might be AI these days is probably not the best legal strategy. And there are probably other ways that one could challenge a piece of evidence. That's not the defendant in the image, or there was someone out of shot holding a gun, or, we've seen those kind of challenges a lot more in the case law database that Anne has put together. Sorry for the plug, but on our website, trueproject.co.uk, Anne has compiled this amazing database of cases, and it's freely available. So that might be something that people want to check out after the show.
I'm going to slightly Stefapedia this as well. I think the European court case you're talking about is also the one involving the downing of a flight MH17, which is why the Netherlands was involved. And we've talked about this on several podcasts, notably, I think, with Marieke de Hoon, the Dutch international law, and we'll link to those in the show notes if you want to know more about that specific case.
I want to introduce an element that's also quite kind of popular at the moment, slopaganda. But just before we do that, I wanted to say that one of the reasons we were talking about doubting true narratives was because long-term supporter of the podcast, Ronald Sly, said that he'd been thinking about that as part of the AI series. So thanks, Ronald, for helping us with the question. You too can support the podcast and send us in questions if you ever want. Just the plug to counter the True Project plug as well, or to add to it, let's say. So slopaganda, and, the sense that we have that there's lots and lots of slop around. We've seen it particularly in the conflict Iran, US, Israel. It has a purpose. Maybe we could describe that purpose, and then maybe also describe what we think might happen with that kind of stuff in court. Is this going to play any part in, I'm not saying there are going to be any trials out of this, but is that the kind of thing that might end up being discussed in court sometime? Start with, what's it for, this slopaganda?
Well, a lot of research has been done on this. Like Niamh McIntyre, who is a journalist based here in the UK, did a big deep dive into who's behind all this AI slop, and particularly in the context of the war in Iran. And it was found that actually a big incentive is monetary. There's a lot of these accounts that are based in Thailand, Cambodia, the Philippines. In other words, in countries that aren't actively involved in the conflict, generating this kind of AI slop, and that content drives engagement, and the engagement drives clicks, and clicks bring money. So that does seem to be a big incentive. Then the other side, of course, is the sort of propaganda side. So we've seen, for example, Donald Trump reposting AI-generated stuff. We've seen the Iranian government repost AI-generated content. So that aspect of it can't be set to one side, but neither can we ignore the very real sort of monetary reasons behind some of this content. In terms of what can be done about it, the Meta Oversight Board had a really interesting decision recently on this exact decision. Like, what should Meta be doing on AI-generated content from the Israeli-Iran war? And they found that, first of all, Meta wasn't really actively implementing its own C2PA standards. So it wasn't actively doing that and flagging content as AI generated. I think that would go a long way in just putting that sort of watermark or warning to viewers that this is AI generated. And also, there's also a role in terms of demonetizing that kind of content and downgrading it. So there's a lot that could be done that falls short maybe of taking it down altogether that platforms could be doing.
We've talked a lot about kind of the problems with possibly AI in this evidence, but is there also a role for AI assisted evidence reconstruction of what houses looked like before and after, plans of a prison, those kind of things?
I think there's a role for this kind of thing in advocacy, in human rights reporting. I would be very wary about using it in criminal trials because, as I think Sarah Zarmsky, my colleague from here in Queen's, I think she's been on the show talking about this before, and she's also written on it. There is that risk of the sort of cognitive bias that comes in seeing something with your own eyes and the way that we process that visual content. It can be highly, highly prejudicial, I would say, and probably that prejudice outweighs its probative value. Sorry to use some legal terms, but in terms of the actual weight that it should be given, its strength as evidence is outweighed by the prejudice that would be caused by it. So I'd be quite wary about using it in the courtroom. I don't know if Anne would agree or disagree.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, I find it very tricky.
Sorry, on this, someone asked me recently, well, what about like witness protection? Couldn't you have like deepfakes? You create an avatar of someone and then you feed that AI model their words, and then it looks like someone is presented, but their identity is completely protected. I mean, again, I think that could be something that would be useful. Maybe we've seen some documentaries, for example, using this or that kind of thing. But in court, really evidence needs to be tested rigorously. And there are well-established ways of protecting witnesses that don't involve turning to AI and creating AI avatars and things like that.
I was going to say, I saw a documentary on, I think, a Mormon polygamist cult where they had the underage wives of this particular kind of prophet. And they said, well, we doctored them because, it looks better so they're not recognizable, but they do look like real people. And they'd say that up front in the documentary, but when you look at it, it's really, your brain doesn't really compute that. They don't look AI. It wasn't uncanny valley kind of where you're like, something is off. So I was really looking at that thinking, I can see why you would do this in a documentary. And I can see that it looks more engaging, right? Especially if you have evidence in courtrooms here where, when we have a protected witness, it's like blocks and pixelated. And of course, that creates a layer of distance. But then I was also thinking, well, the judges don't see them pixelated. They see the real person and they have to judge most of the time, unless it's video evidence. So, when you talked about documentaries, that sprang to mind because I was looking at that thinking, this is so odd, but also very effective visually. And my brain is being tricked into thinking that this is completely normal.
What was in my mind when I wrote the question was work on North Korean prisons that I've done where we used quote unquote blue bodies to represent people because, and didn't give them any characteristics at all. They were just vaguely robotic. But one had a whip and one was cowering and one was, 10 were packed into a cell and so on. But I would have felt distinctly uncomfortable with showing that kind of detail with people that look like people, AIs. I mean, it felt right to make it as, I don't know, as unreal, but effective as possible. Yes, we've gone off on our own tangent, of course, as
we are wont to do.
Yeah, we had another 15 questions, but we're not going to get round to doing them. We're going to wrap up here and just ask you to start with, is there something that you wanted us to ask you that you haven't had a chance to say, Anne, to start with?
I think the main point that we're trying to make is that it's not a new phenomenon. Manipulation has always been around. So I think the big fear with our work as well, when we constantly talking about deepfakes, is that we are doing more fear mongering than good. So I think it's important to be aware of deepfakes and to know that they are quite tricky and risky and difficult to detect. But yeah, we should always approach anything we see online with a healthy dose of skepticism, but not cynicism, not just dismiss everything outright.
Yeah, I couldn't put it any better.
And then we're going to move on to our kind of traditional asymmetrical haircuts question. If you followed the podcast, you've probably heard it before, but we like to ask our guests if there is anything that they've been watching, reading, listening to, or even that they're doing that they want to share with us. It can either be related to the field you're working on, or it can be whatever you do to get away and keep your mental health intact, which is also important in this kind of work. So let's start with Anne. Do you want to share something that you're enjoying listening, reading, or watching?
Well, I'm not reading anything AI related because I feel like I'm doing enough work on that. But I'm currently rereading Nadia Murad's book, The Last Girl, about being held captive by ISIS.
That doesn't seem very calming, honestly.
It's not, but it's a extremely honest and inspiring account of what she went through.
Yvonne?
So usually I like to read fiction to unwind, but there are two really good non-fiction books that I've really enjoyed recently, and one is kind of tangentially related to this. Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams. I don't know if you know about it. It's the inside story. She was the head of global policy at Meta. And it's sort of the inside story. It's been quite controversial. Meta have sued her, and the result of that is that she's been prevented from publicising this book in any way. So she recently was at the Hay Festival in Wales, where she had to sit in silence on the stage and not nod or blink. So while two other people discussed her book, but it's really compellingly written, and she tells a good story. It's quite funny in parts. So I definitely recommend that. I also really enjoyed Patrick Radden Keefe's latest one, London Falling, which is really good. And then podcast I've really been enjoying recently is called The Expert Witness. It's by CBC. Have you seen that? Yeah.
I am fascinated by that.
Yeah. And related to what we've just been talking about, because this new thing called cyber check was suddenly being introduced in domestic criminal trials. And, it sounded all very high tech. It was like, we use machine learning, we use, hashing and cryptographic this and that. And it turned out basically it was nonsense, and it was being used against people and very difficult to sort of argue against, because it was purportedly an AI system. So yeah, I think that's a cautionary tale, that podcast.
No, it really is. And it's especially indeed about, they would just say it's AI, and the AI would essentially like look at all your social media and whatever you did online, and then kind of make this footprint and place people digitally at the scene of crimes, and was used to convict. And when it got to the courtroom, none of the judges or prosecutors could really parse it or challenge it, and there were no expert witnesses to explain what it did, because whenever they got to kind of the secret sauce of the AI, the person who was doing it would be like, well, this is protected, this is my, we're not sharing this, which is, one of the big problems about AI is there's no visibility about the algorithm, which we've talked about in other podcasts. But it's really fascinating how it then gets kind of used and people accept it for what it is. And you really have to have these kind of Don Quixote type prosecutors who go against it. But it's a fascinating podcast. It's The Expert Witness by CBC podcast. We'll link to it.
Great. Now, Anne and Yvonne, thank you so much for making time to have a chat to us to help us along with our AI series. And not sure where we're going to go next, but I'm sure we'll come up with different ones. Don't hesitate to let us know if you think that we should be doing some specific topic, not necessarily related to your one. Thank you so much. Thanks for making the time, Yvonne. Really appreciate, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg. This episode was created in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice efforts for mass violence, and with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.